This film is about the truths and myths of the Vietnam War. It was produced by veterans who served in the war. They want you to learn about the war, and they've provided information here for your consideration, much of it not reported in other films or mentioned at schools and universities. We owe it to these veterans to listen to what they have to say about the war they served in. They consider this film to be their enduring legacy for future generations, and they want to thank you for watching it.
The Vietnam War was a very significant event in our history. Over 2.7 million Americans served during the 16 years of our involvement in that war. 1 out of every 10 Americans who served in Vietnam was a casualty. Over 300,000 were wounded and over 58,000 were killed. Roughly 3 in 10 Vietnam veterans remain alive today. The intensity of combat is reflected in the attrition of planes and helicopters. Over 4,000 fixed-wing aircraft were destroyed, and of the 12,000 helicopters employed during the war, at least 5,600 were lost. The purpose of this documentary is to provide future generations with factual information about the Vietnam War. It was produced by the Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Business Association Foundation on behalf of veterans everywhere. They hope you will find it helpful.
Several years ago, we brought home a group of fighting men who had fought as bravely and as well as any Americans in our history. They came home without a victory, not because they'd been defeated, but because they'd been denied permission to win.
That statement by President Reagan correctly reflects the feelings of most Vietnam veterans today, about 90% of whom are proud of their service and would do it again if called upon. However, many of those veterans have become increasingly concerned that much of what has been written, reported, presented in films, or provided in schools and universities regarding the Vietnam War is neither factual nor complete. The Vietnam veterans who came home, many of them were treated very poorly by Americans, particularly activists who were here protesting the war. They were called baby killer, they had things thrown at them, they were even spat on. Today, many progressive activists say that that is a myth, that in fact, no one was ever spat on who came home from the Vietnam War. But I've spoken to veterans who can testify to the fact that they were spat on, that they were maltreated, that they were shouted at. And for some of them, this was not the America that they had left behind.
We arrived at Travis Air Force Base, California, on a Continental Airlines charter jet. Now, a couple hours later, joyously, we are walking out of the gate, and along comes a hippie bus that tosses out crap upon us. Just stuff, feces, whatever. And suddenly I'm thinking, I've got this dissonance. I can't wrap my mind around the thought of how happy I was, how proud we were to have served our country, answered the call to arms, and returned. And now this, and I couldn't quite get this placed properly in my mind. And so we leave there. Eventually, I'm at the airport in San Francisco about to travel home. And I sit on a bench. Suddenly, people disappeared. Started looking around, is there something wrong with me? And eventually concluded that I've got a uniform on, and no one wants to be around the military.
So we landed at San Francisco International around 7:30 or so in the morning. And I was walking along, kind of feeling like I was walking on eggs through the terminal. And after a minute, I became aware that a small group had amassed itself around me, 6 or 7 pretty filthy-looking hippie types. And they were yelling insults. And one guy stepped up about 1.5 feet from me and spit on me. He got me right here in the chest. That was a very different experience than I would have anticipated after we landed, but unfortunately not all that unusual. I know several other guys who had the same, underwent the same sort of treatment when they arrived back home stateside.
When I landed at Chicago O'Hare, it was very chilly reception. I mean, people would look at you, but not look at your eye. They wouldn't make eye contact with you. And if they were walking down the ramp or the hallway, I mean, they would get way over to one side. I did not have anybody spit on me or anything, but it was extremely uncomfortable. You felt like a stranger. And so it was a funny feeling, because here you're so glad to be back into the U.S., and yet it was extremely uncomfortable with the chilly reception. I went into one of the little restaurants in the airport to get something to eat, and they did not serve me. Now, they didn't tell me they didn't serve me for any particular reason other than, you know, they claimed to be busy, and I waited and waited and waited, and finally decided to leave. I was getting the message. That was my experience. What I care about most is the men and women serving our country today, and what can we do to welcome them home and make them never go through what our group went through.
So I boarded the plane, and I was sitting by the window seat, and a man sat down next to me, and he said, "Where have you been?" And I said, "Vietnam." When I said that, he said, "Oh." And then he stopped talking. I picked up one of those magazines or something, and I fell asleep. I woke up about an hour and a half later, and the stewardess, she was kind of shaking me. I said, "By the way, what happened to the guy that was sitting next to me?" And she said, when he found out you were in Vietnam, he asked to be moved. So that was my first experience with somebody rejecting us.
Vietnam War correspondent Joseph Galloway probably stated it best. They were the best you had, America, and you turned your back on them.
In the midst of the unparalleled political and media malfeasance were the unprecedented humanitarian actions taken by our soldiers, very often at the risk of their own lives. I personally witnessed a typical example involving the 54th Medical Detachment. It was a 40-man helicopter ambulance unit. In 10 months, they evacuated 21,435 patients, including 8,904 civilians and 531 enemy soldiers. Another example was the civil action missions performed by the 5th Special Forces Group that was between 1964 and 1970. It included the creation of 1,003 schools, 398 medical clinics, 6,436 wells, 1,939 kilometers of road, 670 bridges, and 129 churches. And these were just some of the things done by just one unit. Thousands of other examples could be cited. More humanitarian acts than any war in our history. It was a humanitarianism unmatched in the annals of warfare. I've often said that humanitarianism was our great victory in that war.
Anti-aircraft battery opening up.
The strategic implications are clear.
Infantrymen and with tanks.
This is Hanoi after the attack.
Compiègne is here. Marines have moved up more battalions.
Have you felt what you've been doing here is worthwhile?
As to the issue of media bias, we know that it certainly was. People have to realize that the Vietnam War was a two-front war. In this sense, there was a military front and a political and propaganda front. The leaders of North Vietnam at least had the wisdom to study history. They remember that a key reason for their success against France in 1953 and 1954 was their focus on undermining the will of the people of France by propaganda. With the help of their Soviet and other communist allies, North Vietnam began to sow the seeds of protest throughout the United States through communist front organizations, sympathetic media, and radical community organizers, all of whom were able to influence the anti-war movements.
I went to Vietnam in late 1968, briefly as a journalist. I lived in press centers, I traveled around the country, and I got to know a lot of journalists. They didn't know what was going on. They did not want to leave their hotels, and they had South Vietnamese employees who they sent out to get stories. Well, we later learned that many of those South Vietnamese employees were working for the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese.
Pham Xuan An was hired by U.S. news agencies in Vietnam, and he was seen as being a credible source. He was working for American news agencies, including Reuters, New York Times, Herald Tribune. He brilliantly manipulated both U.S. government officials and members of the U.S. press. After the war is made known that he was a spy, and he becomes a general in the North Vietnamese army.
In recent years, a report by Walter Cronkite made in Saigon on February 13th, 1968, has become available. He correctly reported that the 1968 Tet Offensive was a major success for both the United States and the government of South Vietnam.
First and simplest, the Viet Cong suffered a military defeat. Its missions proved suicidal. If they intended to stay in the cities as a negotiating point, they failed at that. The Vietnamese army reacted better than even its most ardent supporters had anticipated. There were no defections from its ranks, as the Viet Cong apparently had expected, and the people did not rise to support the Viet Cong as they also were believed to have expected.
Just 13 days later, on February 27th, 1968, Walter Cronkite made another very different report from New York, written by his producer, apparently, stating the exact opposite of what his previous report from Saigon had said.
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion.
The second report, seen by millions on the CBS Evening News, was very inconsistent with his earlier report and caused public opinion to turn against the war. According to several sources, it greatly influenced President Johnson to not seek re-election after stating, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." The truth is, the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong were defeated in their attacks on more than 100 cities throughout South Vietnam during the 1968 Tet Offensive. Communist forces suffered about 10 times the fatalities they inflicted on the United States and South Vietnamese forces, and in all but one of the areas they attacked, they were driven out within days. General Vo Nguyen Giap later admitted it had been a devastating military loss. The Viet Cong would never again be an effective fighting force thereafter. The rest of the war was fought largely by North Vietnamese regulars. Despite the significant victory by the United States and South Vietnamese military forces on the ground during the Tet Offensive, the news media frequently and misleadingly reported it to be a defeat.
Another myth is that anti-war groups were noble and self-funded. When North Vietnam realized the anti-war protests and an increasingly anti-war American media had turned a devastating military defeat into a resounding political victory, it bolstered their resolve to persevere and pay even more attention to agitation and to propaganda on the U.S. home front. While initially the anti-war movement only had a minor impact on the vast majority of the American public, it had a major impact on Congress and the news media.
Anti-war organizations during the Vietnam War were funded with large budgets by the Soviet Union and the American Communist Party, all in support of North Vietnam, by using effective lobbyists and informants. Many of these organizations had very significant influence on Congress and the news media. Some examples: Soviet-funded agent Wilfred Burkett guided anti-war New York Times reporter Harrison Salisbury, quote, word for word, number for number. And according to Colonel Stanislav Lunev, a defector from Soviet military intelligence, the KGB and the GRU together had a budget for anti-war propaganda in the United States greater than it did for economic and military support, to fund about every anti-war movement and organization in America and abroad, including Vietnam Veterans Against the War, often using money laundered through prominent organizations, including the World Council of Churches, Russian Orthodox Church, and World Peace Council.
The anti-war movement perpetuates many myths. One of the most significant is that about Ho Chi Minh. He gets depicted as a noble nationalist leader similar to George Washington, but he's actually a diehard communist. He implements a Marxist regime in North Vietnam. He rigs elections and wins 99% of them and kills thousands of his political opponents. Ho Chi Minh sends thousands of his surrogates to South Vietnam to create what they call the National Liberation Front, which is supposed to be non-communist, but it's really controlled by Hanoi. We also know it as the Viet Cong. And they use brutal repression, violence to coerce people of South Vietnam into supporting their guerrilla movement. Another myth is that the United States wrongly deprived South Vietnam of elections in 1956. The truth of the matter is that the United States and South Vietnam never signed on to these elections, and that even had they taken place, the North Vietnamese would have used their superior population to rig the outcome.
Several months ago in Detroit, we had an investigation at which over 150 honorably discharged, and many very highly decorated veterans testified to war crimes committed in Southeast Asia.
Not isolated incidents, but crimes committed on a day-to-day basis from their experiences in Vietnam. They told the stories of times that they had personally raped, cut off ears, cut off heads, taped wires from portable telephones to human genitals and turned up the power, cut off limbs, blown up bodies, randomly shot at civilians, razed villages in fashion reminiscent of Genghis Khan, poisoned food stocks, and generally ravaged the countryside of South Vietnam.
The truth is, John Kerry helped to organize the so-called Winter Soldier protest in Detroit and threatened at least one of the young veterans who did go with him from Maryland to Detroit, that if he did not give testimony about witnessing war crimes in Vietnam, he would have to find his own way back home to Maryland. I spoke to that veteran, and he said he came up with the best he could, not wanting to lie. It turned out that many of the so-called witnesses had not served in the military at all. One had been a helicopter mechanic in Germany, another a supply clerk in South Carolina. Very few had actually seen much war in Vietnam, and several of them later retracted their statements when pushed. 30 years later, when John Kerry appeared on Meet the Press, he was asked about his earlier testimony. And on May 6, 2001, John Kerry testified with respect to the charges of war crimes that he had made in his 1971 testimony, and I quote, "Those were the words of an angry young man. I think our soldiers served as nobly on the whole as in any other war, and people need to understand that." Unfortunately, the damage was already done back in 1971.
Jane Fonda was an American actress, and she was also an anti-war activist. She was invited to North Vietnam on an observation tour where she posed with an anti-aircraft gun, wearing a North Vietnamese helmet. She was fed a bunch of lines to repeat to the media, and generally represented herself as, someone who was a concerned citizen who was very worried about the conduct of the war. Right, so Jane Fonda was in Hanoi during the bombings that were taking place. And she was telling the American servicemen who were doing this that it was illegal, telling the sailors out on aircraft carriers and the pilots that the bombs that they were dropping were illegal weapons of war, that they could be tried as war criminals, and things that were just the propaganda lines of the North Vietnamese, but coming from an American actress to give it more visibility and more authenticity. This was a totally false statement that even today many Vietnam War veterans would still regard as treason. Another myth is the war was unwinnable. The apparent lack of decisive progress in the war was largely due to flawed strategies politically imposed on military leaders despite their strong objections. The war could have been won at many different times using sensible strategies, thereby saving thousands of lives and casualties. The argument that war was unwinnable is not valid.
After sending the first ground troops on March 8, 1965, President Johnson and Defense Secretary McNamara adopted a strategy called gradual escalation, or gradualism. This was strongly opposed by the Joint Chief of Staff and other military leaders. This strategy was conceived by so-called whiz kids from the RAND Corporation and the Defense Department, and it was contrary to classical military doctrine and to all the lessons learned over centuries of warfare. It included the limited bombing of North Vietnam called Operation Rolling Thunder. This took place between March of 1965 and October 1968 and involved mostly secondary targets selected during regular Tuesday meetings at the White House when no military leaders were present. Military advice that advocated Soviet surface-to-air missile sites should be destroyed during construction was ignored. As a consequence, during subsequent attacks on military targets in Hanoi, we lost over 1,000 pilots and crew members, and about 50% of the F-105s ever built. The bombing was temporarily stopped 16 different times in an effort to appease North Vietnam and hopefully induce a negotiated peace. A futile effort that conspicuously failed to recognize that communists do not negotiate in good faith. The bombing halts were merely exploited by North Vietnam as an opportunity to build up strength for continued aggression against South Vietnam. This failed strategy of gradual escalation was described by Admiral U.S. Grant Sharp, commander of all U.S. forces in the Pacific, as the most asinine way to fight a war imagined. As a result, Defense Secretary McNamara was forced to resign by early 1968.
U.S. forces in Vietnam had to fight under highly restrictive rules of engagement, which helped protect civilian lives but also led to greater U.S. casualties. The Johnson administration also imposed prohibitions on sending ground forces into Cambodia and Laos, which made it impossible to cut North Vietnamese supply lines. The policy of gradual escalation that Lyndon Johnson and Robert McNamara implemented kept the bombing at a low level and gave the enemy time to build up its air defenses and limited the amount of damage we could do. It's important to remember that the Johnson administration's refusal to go into Laos or Cambodia and to bomb North Vietnam more intensively based on a fear of Chinese intervention, a fear that China and possibly also the Soviets would go to war with the United States. In the 1990s, we received confirmation from former Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin and also from Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai that in fact neither the Soviets nor the Chinese ever intended to fight the United States in Vietnam. These unfounded fears of the Johnson administration prevented the United States from going into Laos and Cambodia or intensifying the war against North Vietnam. Averell Harriman, the Assistant Secretary of State, proposed an agreement to neutralize Laos where both the United States and the North Vietnamese were supposed to leave. But only the Americans leave, and the North Vietnamese stay behind and continue to use it. And it's for this reason that this infiltration route, which we sometimes call the Ho Chi Minh Trail, is referred to as the Averell Harriman Memorial Highway. On several occasions, President Eisenhower informed Johnson and McNamara of flaws in the strategy of gradual escalation. He recommends to Lyndon Johnson and Secretary of Defense McNamara that they take forceful measures in Laos and Cambodia and intensify operations against North Vietnam. But they choose not to listen to the man who had been the Supreme Allied Commander in World War II.
In July 1969, President Nixon began a strategy called Vietnamization. The plan called for the withdrawal of U.S. ground forces and the replacement by South Vietnamese forces on an orderly scheduled timetable. The death of Ho Chi Minh in September 1969 allowed additional time for making Vietnamization a military and political success. U.S. troop strength declined from a peak of 543,000 in April '69 to 335,000 by the end of 1970, with over 90% of South Vietnam relatively secure. However, this plan failed to address North Vietnam's continued and highly effective use of sanctuaries in neutral Laos and Cambodia, where they could mount attacks upon South Vietnam, withdraw to safety when necessary, and continue the shipment of weapons, ammunition, and supplies, which were provided in unlimited quantities by the Soviet Union and China. In response, President Nixon authorized a successful invasion of Cambodia on April 30th, 1970, that enabled American troop withdrawals to continue. Predictably, this invasion was very unpopular with protesting anti-war groups, and on December 22nd, Congress passed legislation to prohibit the use of U.S. force or advisors in Laos and Cambodia. Under international law, however, it was legal for the U.S. to enter both Laos and Cambodia, a very important point that many of our political leaders either did not understand or did not want to understand.
After some hard lessons, Nixon eventually learned that negotiations with North Vietnam were largely futile and decided to use the strategy recommended by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other military leaders since 1965, a strategy that involved intensive strategic bombing of all North Vietnamese military, logistical, and transportation targets, including many previously off-limits in Hanoi and Haiphong. The first major bombing campaign, called Linebacker 1, began on April 10, 1972, during a major invasion by North Vietnam called the Easter Offensive that only involved the South Vietnamese Army and no U.S. ground troops. The bombing damage was severe and had more impact on the war-making capability of North Vietnam than was achieved by 3.5 years of Operation Rolling Thunder. By early October 1972, the leaders of North Vietnam recognized that their invasion had failed and negotiations were preferable.
As 1972 drew to a close, U.S. troop strength was down to 24,000 for support and none for combat. With a new anti-war Congress to be seated in January, it became apparent that North Vietnam was stalling the negotiation process. Under these circumstances, Nixon ordered Operation Linebacker 2 that began on December 18, 1972, and involved the mining of Haiphong Harbor, the destruction of all surface-to-air missile sites around Hanoi, as well as railroads, power plants, and fuel and storage plants. The damage was so extensive, it precipitated the Paris Peace Treaty, signed on January 27, 1973, and all but 50 U.S. troops left South Vietnam. Article 7 of the Paris Peace Treaty committed the United States to sustain South Vietnam with the same level of air support, equipment, weapons, ammunition, and supplies that existed in January 1973. However, Congress reneged on these commitments by reducing our funding support for South Vietnam from $2.8 billion in 1973 to only $300 million in 1975. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union and China increased their support to North Vietnam by over 50% during the same period. And in June 1973, under pressure from anti-war lobbyists in Congress, they passed a bill that prohibited any funding for airstrikes in Laos and Cambodia. Without the funding for air support, equipment, ammunition, and supplies promised by the United States, North Vietnam decided to ignore the Paris Peace Treaty and once again invaded South Vietnam in early 1975. On April 10th, President Ford asked Congress to approve emergency funding for military and humanitarian assistance to South Vietnam. The request never even came up for a vote, and Saigon surrendered on April 30th.
Within 3 years, 3.5 million South Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian civilians had been murdered, starved to death, or drowned fleeing communist brutality. This is a terrible tragedy. It is almost comparable to the Holocaust of World War II. But this has been erased from history, practically covered up by the U.S. media, the educational establishment, and the political establishment.
The gruesome reality is that more Laotians, Cambodians, and Vietnamese died in the 10 years after the communist takeover than were killed in the prior 20 years of war.
The war was winnable years earlier and with far fewer American casualties had President Lyndon Johnson and Secretary of Defense McNamara listened to professional military advice, including that from former President Dwight Eisenhower. As the counselor on international law to the Department of State, during the 1973 negotiations on the Paris Accords, I personally witnessed how the full application of American military power by President Nixon brought the war to a close literally in a matter of weeks. At any time in the previous 16 years, the war was winnable by applying the following normal warfighting recommendations that had been made to President Johnson and Secretary McNamara. Victory did not require an invasion of the North, did not require use of nuclear weapons, did not require bombing of the North Vietnamese civilian population or other extraordinary actions. Rather, it merely required normal warfighting 101.
There were many alternate strategies and actions that could have been taken that would have shortened the war, been more decisive, I think, and more effective, and would have saved the lives of thousands of Americans and South Vietnamese. I can give you several examples of this, one of which was recommended by the Joint Chiefs of Staff many times, as early as 1965, but even subsequent to that. And that was to use our very powerful air forces in a massive air campaign, a strategic air campaign against North Vietnam. It took a massive bombing campaign in 1972 by Nixon that finally had the telling effect of bringing them to the negotiating table. So had we used this strategic bombing earlier on, the war would have been shortened, and I think the outcome would have been much more favorable. There were many other opportunities to change our strategy or take more decisive actions. This was especially true in 1967 when the North Vietnamese were unable to make up their manpower losses or their logistical losses. And clearly it was obvious in 1968, following the Tet Offensive, that they were in a very, very serious position, and we could have changed our strategy and won the war. The war definitely could have been won had we gone into Laos and cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was recommended by General Westmoreland, who was in charge of all the American forces in South Vietnam. It was also recommended by Ellsworth Bunker, the ambassador, and by the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, and by other military leaders, but that was rejected by our State Department and by President Johnson.
I have now ordered that all air, naval, and artillery bombardment of North Vietnam cease.
This strategy of cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail in eastern Laos would have eliminated the need for the U.S. to protect the 1,400-mile border of South Vietnam with Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. It would have changed the requirement from defending 1,400 miles of border to just the 225 miles along that barrier from the East China Sea to the Mekong River. It also would have required fewer troops in country. In addition to that, there was an added advantage. We would be fighting this war in an area that was largely unpopulated and where American firepower could be used without restrictions. This strategy also would pass on pacification to the South Vietnamese, which were culturally and politically better adaptable to do this mission. Our military would be better served actually fighting the North Vietnamese Army in Laos and northern I Corps, where we could use U.S. military firepower to defeat them. Probably the best evidence that cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail was the means of achieving success and victory was a statement made by Colonel Bui Tin. Colonel Bui Tin was the official communist who accepted the surrender of South Vietnam in April 1975. In 1995, he was interviewed for an article in the Wall Street Journal, and the journalist asked him, what could the Americans have done to win the war? And his answer was to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. Had LBJ, or President Johnson, allowed Westmoreland to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, North Vietnam could not win the war.
The domino theory was often maligned by critics of the war who argue that it was disproved when South Vietnam falls in 1975 and you only see a few of the dominoes falling. But I believe that it was true in 1965 when it caused the U.S. to go into war, and in fact, our intervention in Vietnam is what accounts for the fact that most of the dominoes don't fall. And most important among these is Indonesia, which clearly was saved by American intervention in Vietnam.
Today we know from a half century of evidence that the following are truths about the Vietnam War, counter to persistent myths about that war. The war began when North Vietnam opened the Ho Chi Minh Trail to attack South Vietnam in clear violation of the United Nations Charter. The United States was lawfully assisting in the defense of South Vietnam against this North Vietnamese aggression. Now, the American media, which had initially supported the war, turned against the war. That was a significant factor in undermining the United States' national will to win. While war crimes such as My Lai did take place on the United States South Vietnamese side of the war and were a serious failure harming the war effort, they were counter to U.S. policy in the war, were prosecuted under the Uniform Code of Military Justice by the United States, and were not even close to the official and systematic brutality of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. The war in the end was not decided by a guerrilla struggle, but by Korean War-style 21 Division Regular Army North Vietnamese tank invasion in violation of the Paris Accords after the United States Congress forced an end to effective American assistance. Even at that time, had American air power been turned loose on that regular army invasion from the north, South Vietnam would be a free nation today.
Decades back in late 1972, South Vietnam and the United States were winning the Vietnam War decisively by every conceivable measure. That's not just my view. That was the view of our enemy, the North Vietnamese government officials. Victory was apparent when President Nixon ordered the U.S. Air Force to bomb industrial and military targets in Hanoi, North Vietnam's capital city, and in Haiphong, its major port city. And we would stop the bombing if the North Vietnamese would attend the Paris peace talks that they had left earlier. The North Vietnamese did go back to the Paris peace talks, and we did stop the bombing, as promised. On January the 23rd of 1973, President Nixon gave a speech to the nation on primetime television, announcing that the Paris Peace Accords had been initialed by the United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, the Viet Cong, and the accords would be signed on the 27th. What the United States and South Vietnam received in those accords was victory. At the White House, it was called VV Day, Victory in Vietnam Day. The U.S. backed up that victory with a simple pledge within the Paris Peace Accords, saying should the South require any military hardware to defend itself against any North Vietnam aggression, we would provide replacement aid to the South on a piece-by-piece, one-to-one replacement, meaning a bullet for a bullet, a helicopter for a helicopter, for all things lost, replacement. The advance of communist tyranny had been halted by those accords. Then it all came apart, and it happened this way. In August of the following year, 1974, President Nixon resigned his office as a result of what became known as Watergate. 3 months after his resignation came the November congressional elections, and within them the Democrats won a landslide victory for the new Congress. And many of the members used their new majority to defund the military aid that the United States had promised, peace for peace, breaking the commitment that we made to the South Vietnamese in Paris to provide whatever military hardware the South Vietnamese needed in case of aggression from the North. Put simply and accurately, a majority of Democrats of the 94th Congress did not keep the word of the United States. On April the 10th of 1975, President Gerald Ford appealed directly to those members of the Congress in an evening joint session televised to the nation. In that speech, he literally begged the Congress to keep the word of the United States. But as President Ford delivered his speech, many of the members of the Congress walked out of the chamber. Many of them had an investment in America's failure in Vietnam. They had participated in demonstrations against the war for many years, and they wouldn't give the aid. On April the 30th, South Vietnam surrendered, and re-education camps were constructed, and the phenomenon of the boat people began. If the South Vietnamese had received the arms that the United States promised, would the result have been different? It already had been different. The North Vietnamese leaders admitted that they were testing the new president, Gerald Ford, and they took one village after another, then cities, then provinces, and our only response was to go back on our word. The U.S. did not resupply the South Vietnamese as we had promised. It was then that the North Vietnamese knew they were on the road to South Vietnam's capital city, Saigon, that would soon be renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Former Arkansas Senator William Fulbright, who had been the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, made a public statement about the surrender of South Vietnam. He said this, "I am no more distressed than I would be about Arkansas losing a football game to Texas." The U.S. knew that North Vietnam would violate the accords, and so we planned for it. What we did not know was that our own Congress would violate the accords, and violate them, of all things, on behalf of the North Vietnamese. That's what happened. I'm Bruce Hershenson.
There are several lessons to be learned from the Vietnam War that can prevent us from making the same mistakes again. We should never enter any war without the will to win it. McNamara, who was incredibly ignorant about military matters and had disdain for the generals he oversaw, ignored both their advice and the advice of the intelligence community that hitting the enemy softly was not only not going to work, it was actually encouraging the enemy. We should be wary of international agreements with enemies who routinely ignore their commitments. We made an agreement to keep Laos neutral, for example, and even after Hanoi had violated it openly time and time again, we kept our military from doing things that would have speeded up the war and produced a different outcome. We need to have knowledgeable national security lawyers involved in the process from the start. There were many things the United States might have legally done to fight the war, but lawyers who did not know this area of the law assumed they would be illegal and kept us from doing that.
Perhaps at this late date, we can all agree that we've learned one lesson: that young Americans must never again be sent to fight and die unless we are prepared to let them win.